Starting from scratch in January 2014 as a citizen media initiative with no starting capital, Euromaidan Press is now number 4 in terms of readership amongst English language media about Ukraine, as well as being a well-known action hub connecting pro-Ukrainian activists worldwide. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. Please like and subscribe to increase the popularity of our content in YouTube's algorithm and get alerts about our latest videos. Alya Shandra is editor-in-chief at Euromaidan Press. She has a background in environmental science and NGOs. During the Euromaidan revolution, Alya launched an indie media outlet called Euromaidan Press, and that project was fueled by her interest in how to help Ukraine permanently move beyond a post-communist, post-colony country and evolve into a free and democratic society that tackles corruption and nepotism. Alya, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for inviting me.
It's a great pleasure to speak to you. And before we dive into some of the more detailed issues about hybrid war, I'd love to learn more about the publication, how it emerged from the Euromaidan movement, and obviously more details about that for people who may not be quite so familiar with the detail of those events.
Okay, so the Euromaidan revolution, a time of great upheaval and also a time of horizontal movements of people self-organizing to help the protests. At that point in my life, I was growing more and more disillusioned with life in Ukraine, and I was understanding that it needed to change. So I joined the protests, and since I knew English, I joined a team of translators that were running social media accounts to get news from the protesters' perspective into the English language world and later into the world of other languages. When the Euromaidan revolution won, we didn't stop because basically it was all starting. We thought that during the revolution, I told the story a lot. During the revolution, when I was spending days and nights in the protesters' headquarters, and we were just translating all the time, posting, updating all the time about what is happening in Kiev and in other cities, I had a dream. When this is all over, I told myself I will climb into the highest mountain in Ukraine, in the Carpathians, and I will spend 2 weeks there all alone. I never got to that mountain because it never ended. Because
you haven't done that since, I take it. So
no,
8 years later, you haven't done that.
It hasn't ended. It hasn't ended. So I still cannot do that. Because our revolution, it was immediately met by a backlash, a Russian imperial backlash, and basically that's why we kept going, because we felt that we needed to help Ukraine have its voice heard in the world. We felt that we needed to organize Ukrainians and facilitate Ukraine's ability to speak for itself in the international world. And basically, like during the Euromaidan revolution, I experienced the power of Russian propaganda on myself firsthand. And this Russian propaganda was coming through Western media outlets. So I had a person who I was very close to, and he had plans to visit Ukraine, but sooner, and I was telling him about Euromaidan and how awesome it was that Ukraine was having this revolution, that it wanted to change life in the country. But he wasn't believing me very much. He said that he didn't like my revolution because it was a far-right revolution, and there were Nazis on Euromaidan. And no amount of my persuasion could convince him that it's not a far-right revolution. There's nothing to be afraid of.
And that narrative, sorry to jump in, that narrative continues to this day, doesn't it? And
it does. It's just amazing how much it sticks, and I think it really talks more about Western society's fears of themselves than about Ukraine, because obviously there's a fascination with the far right, a fear of the far right in Western societies. because probably if the far right's influence there, because as in Ukraine, this influence is much smaller. I mean, we don't have a far right party in parliament right now. It wasn't a far right party was not elected after Euromaidan. And I mean, in every society, there will be your percent of people who espouse far right ideologies and participate in far right movements. But they are, if I may compare them with Western Europe, they are less pronounced here than elsewhere.
I mean, in
So,
Italy, they've just elected
yeah.
a far-right government. I'm speaking tomorrow to an Italian academic who's going to talk about the rise of the far right. They're actually in government, and they were pro-Putin until quite recently. Behind the scenes, possibly they still are.
But basically, you know, this demonization of Ukraine as somehow Nazi, far right, etc. It's absolutely. I mean, it can only happen because people know so little about Ukraine. So when there's little on the ground knowledge, little real knowledge of the country and people who live in it, of course, myths can spread, and Russia exploits this. It exploits the world's little familiarity with Ukraine. This is why these myths can flourish, and this is also one of the reasons why we work. We want there to be less myths about Ukraine. We want to explain ourselves. We want to talk to the world. We want to show what we're fighting for and shine a light into the society that so few people know about. I mean, basically, I mean, very few people from Western Europe have traveled here. Very few people from North America have traveled here. So it's, in a way, it's a big terra incognita, and we want to make it less terra incognita, and to get
We'll come to this as well later, but the whole imperial project is, you know, during the Soviet Union and even more recently, is to dismiss, let's say, Ukrainian language, literature, culture as being provincial, as being secondary to the, you know, the imperial canon of literature and so on. And I think now that there's a lot more of the world's attention on Ukraine, those that aren't brainwashed, I think it's going to take a lot longer, isn't it, to recognize Ukraine as, you know, not just an independent country, but a strong independent culture, a vibrant sort of culture, language and literature. That's a longer, slower process.
Absolutely. Ukraine is only in the process of generating the symbols that it will be associated with. It's only, I must say that we're only in the process of understanding our own culture, our own literature, because I mean, until recently, Ukraine has not even uncovered the repressed names of its cultural scene. I mean, we have to understand that when we're talking about Ukrainian culture, and this is something also that bothers Ukrainians. So, like the Russians, they have a lot of names that are known internationally. Who do we have? Yeah, and there's the search for who do we have. But first of all, we have to understand that one, there were very many names that were oppressed, and two, there was just an executed renaissance in the 1920s when all of these cultural figures were starting to flourish, were starting to just rise after these centuries of imperial domination. And I mean, also in the Russian Empire, we have to understand that, well, we have Nikolai Gogol, who is known as a Russian author, but who is actually Ukrainian and who wrote about Ukrainian life. I mean, his career path was very characteristic for the Russian Empire. He gravitated towards the center to make a career. Gravitated towards St. Petersburg and basically wrote in the Russian language in order to make himself more known. And this is why he was appropriated basically as a Russian writer. And that is the story of very many cultural figures in Ukraine.
And yet, as an outsider, I mean, you had to be an outsider to perhaps write with the kind of humor and the depth that he wrote. So he brought something else to that, didn't he? And he founded a whole school of that kind of literature. And then Dostoevsky, certainly his early short stories, very Gogolian in some respects. So,
well, of course, he exerted a tremendous influence on Russian culture also. But right now, you know, you mentioned Dostoevsky. Right now, there's this also big movement of reappraising Russian literature and the meanings that it carries. Because, well, for instance, when I was learning literature in school, most of the literature that we read, it was Russian literature. We actually studied very few writers from outside. So basically, this Russian literary canon,
Mm.
Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and others, it was the basis of our upbringing and the basis of very many people, upbringing of many people. So um, when this is part of Russia's imperial influence, imperial cultural influence. So now, people have grown up with the feeling that, yes, Russian culture is great and Ukrainian, it's just like some little culture. But the reason that they're thinking of this is because they just learned this in school, because this was the way that the Soviet Union continued the colonization of Ukraine and other peoples in this empire. Yes, let's name it like it was. The Soviet Union was also a continuation of the Russian Empire. Right now, Ukraine is undergoing immense development and reassessing the meanings that Russian literature actually carried, the way that the imperial influence that it exerted, and also trying to understand why the heck does Russia behave this way, judging from its literature.
Absolutely. And it's affected journalism too, hasn't it? I've been speaking to a number of journalists recently. They were describing how revolutionary the last decade or so has been with, Ukrainian journalism, school style of journalism, and the many publications that have sprung up, and especially over the last 8 years. It's a total sort of revolution in the style and practice of journalism compared to, say, the Soviet period. And yet that's almost completely ignored by the Russian journalistic community back when there was one. I mean, now obviously most have fled or gone underground or in prison. But again, you have this almost unconscious attitude there of, the imperial attitude compared to what they would call perhaps the sort of provincial, Ukrainian culture. And yet what you're at the head of here is quite a significant revolution in journalistic practice.
Well, you're right about the imperial attitude. I mean, even unwillingly, most Russians will exert it. I mean, it's something that Ukrainians have grown especially sensitive to in recent months, and basically, um, you can very often find posts like condescending posts. Oh, those Ukrainians, those nice, cute people like my granny in the village, something like that. That speak a language like my granny in the village.
Mm.
You can also encounter this imperial attitude to Ukrainian journalism as other spheres of life. So the imperial mm, the imperial viewpoint continues in Russia, and but regarding journalism, of course, after Euromaidan, it's not only in journalism; it's in all spheres of life. Basically, Ukraine, it has just accelerated Ukraine's development. It has, like the Euromaidan revolution, when it was happening, it set off the starting point of a revolution that's still ongoing now. I mean, during these 8 years, we constantly look back to the memory of Euromaidan and remembered what it was about. It was about a dream of a better life. It was a dream of a life of a democratic country, of a strong democratic country that would be where people would be free to fulfill their dreams, to live the life that they want without having to emigrate elsewhere. And I mean, independent media, of course, is one of the major ways that this can be achieved. And basically, after Euromaidan, we are seeing a diversification of funding of media. We're seeing very many media projects that are trying to become independent. They don't yet have the influence of TV, but Um, but they are growing, they're finding new ways to communicate with their audiences, and it's an ongoing process. I mean, during the formation of Hromadske TV, it was a major event that preceded the Euromaidan revolution, because and it was a big thing when it was launched. I remember listening to the podcasts and the broadcasts at work, and these were basically the first major discussions about life during the Yanukovych era and where it was heading. During the Euromaidan revolution, a number of streaming initiatives sprung up. The live streams from Maidan, that were watched through all around the world. And
Mm.
Hromadske TV today, it continues its development as an independent media. But other media outlets, they also sprung up, and they're also now they're seeking funding from their readers. A number of forms are developing, because I must say that Ukrainians are slowly getting accustomed to the idea that if you're not paying for information, somebody else is doing it for you,
Mm-hmm.
and that somebody else is probably showing you things that he wants you to see. And I'm talking, of course, about the oligarchic media, because media, especially before the Euromaidan revolution, it was seen as a way to exert political influence. So the idea was that it was like this sort of controlled democracy,
Yeah.
oligarchic democracy, when an oligarch, meaning a very rich person with political influence, would invest into a media channel in order to promote the political candidates that would then later allow him to keep power and to keep getting rich.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, it wasn't anything about public debate. It wasn't these media channels. They promoted the interests of their owners, but they did not promote the interests of the Ukrainian people and the modernization of the nation that they wanted. But I mean, with the growing creative class, with the growing middle class in Ukraine, people are they are paying for their media. They're supporting them on Patreon with subscriptions and other ways, and of course, this is all enabling the development of the sphere. But after with the war, I have to I have to say this. All of these medias, they are under great duress, because the country's economy is in extremely difficult conditions. So if you can in any way support Ukrainian media, I'm really asking you to do this. It will help Ukraine get through this period.
So what can people do to help? I mean, it's a question I was going to ask at the end, but I think it's really pertinent to put that in now. Should people take subscriptions out, make donations, small Patreon monthly donations to just try and fuel independent media?
Well, they can support any independent media from Ukraine that they like, and most of the medias, they are running their own Patreon subscriptions. Our colleagues from the Kiev Independent, they're also running a fundraiser to help Ukrainian media, and other organizations are too. We have a list of ways that you can help Ukraine on our website. It's on our main page. You can open it and find the ways to help Ukrainian media right now.
And we'll pop that into the description of the video when it's published up. You'll be able to find that all in the in the description there. And one of the challenges, I guess, as well, is that advertising revenues are always a problem, but at this time, the advertising market has shrunk significantly, and of course, until the war's over and those advertising revenues start to pick up along with the economy, you're not really able to, I'm guessing, earn much from what it used to be. Probably quite an important revenue stream.
Well, thankfully, our media is not that affected, because we're supported by readers from all around the world. A shout out to our wonderful patrons. Thank you for being with us. So thanks to them, we can get through this period. But Ukrainian media, of course, it's a big hit for them, because many of them are dependent on partner projects that, of course, now have fewer money to spend on this.
I'm fascinated by the point you made about quality journalism and journalist activism translating into action on the streets, translating into protests, people defending their rights. there are, liberal independent media in Russia. There was Echo, Moskvy, Dozhd. I mean, there's Navalny's team. So there are independent voices in Russia, but they don't seem to translate in the same way into protest action, physical action, to create that sort of democratic culture. I mean, do you have any thoughts about why that might be?
Well, first, I think I must challenge your point about there being independent media in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
From what I have read, there wasn't really any independent media. They all had to compromise in order to remain with the regime. And even now, with Medusa in exile, you can see them starting each one of these posts. This post was produced by an agent and for an agent.
Foreign agent law, yes.
So
Yeah.
they have this disclaimer on each one of their posts, even though they have all gone into exile. So even from abroad, they are still complying with the regime, and it's insane. It's absolute insanity. So, I mean, as I have understood, it was somehow the story of the frog in the boiling pot. Little by little, they made compromises and were forced, in order to just keep abroad, to make these compromises and later other compromises. And that way, of course, saying that they are truly independent, I don't think that is possible. Of course, there were media that were more independent than the absolutely Kremlin propaganda ones. But generally, I think it must be a question of not even media, but it's a question about society, I guess. Like, why did these media tolerate this frog in the pot thing? Why did
and there's a
they
certain
accept?
passivity. I mean, you can absorb news, you can understand it, you can have a liberal point of view, but you can then be passive in reaction to that information. Or the situation you
I
described
think
in Euromaidan,
I
is
think
that translated to activism?
I think that it's more about the political culture in a region. I mean, Ukraine, it has never liked authoritarian rule. We have a freedom gene. I know that this sounds a little bit like very full of pathos, but I think it is in our blood. A freedom gene, because we have had very many rebellions against authorities that tried to rule over us. Whereas in Russia, they have lived under authoritarianism for very, very many centuries, and starting from Tsarist rule, basically, from the time that the Mongols, they with Kievan Rus falling under their invasion. After this followed a period of for the Moscow kingdom, that it lived under the yoke of the Mongols. And starting from that time, Russia was always ruled by authoritarian leaders. And basically, it's somehow a fatalistic, I think, attitude of society that this will not be changed. I mean, what can you do with it? You have to just put up with it. I mean, you won't change it. You will not change anything, basically. And I have heard this story about just recently that Euromaidan, it really started as a massive protest after students were beat up in November 2013. So they were just staying on the center of the city, on Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square, and they just decided to stay the whole night in order to just talk and continue their protest in the night. And at that time, riot police was sent to the square. They beat up the students. The students ran away in the night to a nearby monastery that opened their doors to protect them from this barricade. And afterward, it was something unheard of, like just police beating up protesters. This wasn't something that happened in Ukraine, basically. And in the morning, it was shocking. It was shocking for many people that their kids that were just on the square in the night, that they were just beat up. Like, it wasn't something that Ukrainians were about to take. And I just heard about the story that in the morning, many people came to the center to see what was going to happen, because they were mad. And there was a Moscow journalist, from Moscow, from one of those independent medias that you said, and he was saying, "Hey guys, like, calm down. I mean, we already got used to it. I mean, you won't change anything. Just get used to it. It should look like how it is in Moscow and in Belarus. And Ukrainians were not about to get used to it. That day, millions came to the street. It was estimated that about 1 million people came to protest about after the beating of the students. It was the start of massive protests that triggered off that lasted for 3 months and ended with Yanukovych regime fleeing.
And that gives the lie. I mean, one of the most persistent narratives I see. I mean, this isn't mainstream narrative, but there are many extreme leftists. There are a lot on the right as well, both in the UK, America, and around Europe, who buy into the Kremlin propaganda narrative that Euromaidan was not an organic, bottom-up protest that really originated on the streets, that actually the entire thing was a CIA plot. I mean, as absurd as it sounds, as tiring as it must be to be asked this question numerous times, this is a propaganda narrative that is still persistent. So how do we deal with that?
I think, and that's a great question, how to deal with that, because I have found that people that want to believe something, they will keep believing it no matter how many facts you give to them. But I would like to ask them if they had ever organized at least one protest. I really would like to know what things they could have organized, what things they organized in their lives, because usually people who believe that it's possible to organize like such a massive movement to get millions of people in the streets, like how do they actually think that it works? Like, what is the level of organization that you need to have to do all of this? I mean, just look at all of the horizontal movements that formed in Euromaidan. There was a movement for self-defense. There was a movement to cook. There was a movement to do journalism. There was a movement to an art movement. There were girls walking around with angel wings handing flowers to the barricades. There were so many people organized at so many scales. How do they imagine somebody like rigging all of this? You can't or give like roles to 1 million people for them to do everything to work together to make a revolution happen. And it's really absurd for me to hear how the left wingers explain this, use their like hatred of the United States just to believe in this absurd myth, because it is the leftists who should be supportive of grassroots movements. It is the leftists who should be supportive of people power, knocking down authoritarian regimes. This is literally what you're supposed to be about. Come on, don't let your Americaphobia blind you so much. I mean, there's only it is just absurd to think that somebody could have rigged these million strong protests all over the country, all united towards one thing.
I actually interviewed a director of counterinsurgency in the CIA who'd worked in Russia. And we talked about this, and he said he just wished the CIA had that amount of control or organization or ability to, mobilize people in that way. And he made the point you're making, is that it's just organizationally impossible, and it would cost billions of dollars to do.
Absolutely. And I mean, I had just like to compare, like a good comparison actually, to Euromaidan and this grassroots people power that is successful, that is able to mobilize so many people and inspire so many people to fight. To contrast this, let's compare it to what Russia is doing. Basically, there is also the illusion of support for the regime, and even the illusion of like youth support for the regime. But I mean, just analyzing it, it is just so obvious how orchestrated it all is. Vladislav Surkov, one of Vladimir Putin's aides, he was in charge of creating a youth movement in support of Russia, and the aim of the youth movement was to counter the protests that were erupting more and more often. And I mean, these Nazi, if you look at the photos of this movement, they are just like it's so obvious that they were placed in these organized rows, that they're all dressed in the same clothes. They're all saying the same thing. They look like brainwashed robots. I mean, this is what an orchestrated movement looks like. Compare it to Euromaidan, you will see nothing of the sort. Like
Chaos. I
an
mean, it's
orchestrated,
chaotic.
yeah.
It's complex, chaotic, and as you
It's
say,
chaotic
people are.
complex and it's crowdsourced. It's crowdfunded and it's
Mhm.
crowdsourced. It has people bringing, I mean, if it was organized by the CIA, I'm sorry, they would be given out like good shields, good metal shields to protect them about from the Berkut. But if we look at the videos, we see a multitude, a hodgepodge of wooden, plastic, metal
Mm.
shields. We see people in ski helmets. We see them in other helmets. We see an absolute mismatch of styles and objects and materials that are used to protect themselves. And
Mm.
this is the most obvious thing that gives away a grassroots protest, the materiality of it all. If it's a crowdsourced hodgepodge, it was not organized either by the CIA or the Kremlin or anybody else.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned there's a really interesting name there, because not only did 2014 and Euromaidan, and then later 2014, not only did that prompt a surge in civil society and self-organization in Ukraine, it prompted a mirror response, didn't it? A sort of opposite response from Russia, which was to instigate hybrid war. Now, this guy you mentioned, Surkov, who unlike Dugin, he genuinely was Putin's brain, and he was the architect of the Crimea invasion and the hybrid war in Donbass. Could you tell me something about him and his role in this? Because even though hybrid war has moved to sort of hot war now, it was effective for a while, and then it ceased to be effective, didn't it? So I know you've researched this quite a bit. Could you describe to us what happened?
Um, sure. Well, Vladislav Surkov, he's known as Putin's Rasputin in a way. So the great cardinal of the Kremlin, through whom all political processes in Russia had gone through. So basically, he's the architect of this so-called controlled democracy, where we have elections, but there's really no choice. There is an illusion of democracy taking place, but just one man rules everything. So the architect of this regime and was Vladislav Surkov. So by education, he is a theater director, but it was an unfinished education. But I think that this proximity for plays, this proximity for this propensity for theatrics, it is what went into the basis of this controlled democracy and what Vladislav Surkov tried to also employ in Ukraine. So basically, the idea is with Surkov. So I researched this by examining his emails that were hacked by Ukrainian hackers in 2015. They cover the period of 2014-2016, and we are seeing what I saw was Surkov trying to organize very many theatrics. He was trying to organize a virtual reality in Ukraine that would impact the minds of the Ukrainian population and its leaders so that decisions are made in Russia's favor. So basically, it was an attempt to hack our brains so we would make the decisions that Russia wants, and thus, of course, go back to Russia's sphere of influence. How is this made? When we talk about fake news in the West, very often we mean something like Twitter trolls, like a troll farm, or like Facebook groups, maybe, or maybe some RT, right? But the thing is that all of these medias, they create a virtual reality, so to speak, like when we have like a Twitter network that amplifies some fake narratives or maybe some fake things that are spread by Kremlin-controlled medias. In Ukraine, Surkov was trying to organize a virtual reality on the ground. So as opposed to virtual reality in the media space with trolls, medias, etc. He was trying to make this virtual reality on the ground. So what this means was there were a lot of gongos, there were a lot of just civic activist groups, there were a lot of politicians and medias that were bribed to create a picture that the Kremlin wanted to see. And the idea behind this was that this picture that they were creating, it would somehow start to influence reality. And I guess this is what happened in Russia, but Ukraine, it did not work. So just an example of how this was all orchestrated. The Kremlin was trying to exploit Ukraine's process for decentralization and changes to the constitution that enable this decentralization. So this is something that was part of the Minsk agreements. It was trying to jump into this process in order to promote a soft federalization of Russia's regions. I'm sorry, of Ukrainian regions. A soft federalization that would mean that they would decide on their own budget, they would decide on language issues, they would all decide things by themselves, right? And potentially this means a lot more opportunities for the Kremlin to intervene in the political life of these regions. Of course, it's easier to bribe local politicians than those in Kiev. So just imagine one day before a conference is held where a bribed political force, bribed MPs would present their coalition for promoting changes in Ukraine's constitution. One day before this, Surkov is being sent photos of the chairs that they would sit on, and the banners that would be behind their backs. He was orchestrating every tiny little thing of it, like a true theater director. He was choosing the decorations, the chairs that they would sit on.
I was going to say puppet master,
and the logos.
theater director or puppet master. Yeah,
exactly. So he created the decorations, and then his puppets, his paid-for puppets, they would voice ideas that were designed in the Kremlin. And outside, while this was happening, while they were presenting their so-called civic initiative for promoting the changes to Ukraine's constitution that Russia wants, outside there was another orchestrated event. It was a paid-for protest where grannies that were paid like small sums, but this was enough for their to entice them to go out and stand for a couple of hours. They were also holding printed out signs that were urging for these soft federalization of Ukraine, basically, and promoting Russian propaganda narratives like "Stop the war" and like "We want to be friends with Russia," etc., etc.
And Russian language is being repressed. I mean, that's another one that I still hear occasionally. And even amongst refugees of the older generation, they will occasionally say, "Oh, yes, it's terrible, but we couldn't practice our language." And then you get the younger generation saying, "No, that's rubbish. Just that didn't happen to you, did it?" And then the granny will say, "Well, it didn't happen to me, but I heard a story from somebody else that so and so happened to them." So you also have this sort of anecdotal propaganda that gets into people's brains and creates an alternative picture of reality, one that doesn't exist.
It's amazing, but one of our journalists just visited Izum. This is a city that was just recently liberated from Russian occupation. And you can see how Russian propaganda actually influenced the people that were living under this occupation. And they were like saying, "Oh, the Russians are not so bad. They just had orders to shoot." And our journalists asked them, "Come on, but wait, who ruined your house? Who shot at your house? Why don't you have a place to live?" "Oh yeah, it was the Russians, but they were told to do it." So in a way, this propaganda, it's just, it messes with people's brains, and also for the people living in Ukraine, it's just incredible what it does. It's a great question for me, actually, how to detoxify people from this worldview that they have been
that's a
imbued
question
in.
I've asked everybody I've interviewed, and I don't think there's a simple answer. I think the common answer that everyone comes up with is it takes a very, very long time. You know,
It
it takes
does.
at least as long as they were exposed to the propaganda, if not longer. And even then, they've also said it's age related. So you're more likely to perhaps recover that if you are younger and have a slightly more flexible mind. If you're older generation, 50s, 60s, etc., or older, then it becomes much harder.
Well, of course, in the 50s, 60s, we must understand that they also lived in the Soviet Union. They were, first of all, they lived in an authoritarian state. So this impacts their way of thinking a lot. And they were also exposed to Russian imperial propaganda during the Soviet era for a much longer time.
Yeah.
So, of course, they will have other associations. They will have, it's like a knee-jerk reaction, that was formed over decades. Yeah, but it's incredible, how people will choose to believe what they hear in Russian media over their lived reality. And we see this in various Ukrainian cities and the ones that were under Russian occupation also. Like, for instance, in Mariupol, remember the girl that famously that became famous in the maternity hospital, the one that was the star of the pictures of Evgenia Malolietka. Russian media later interviewed her, and BBC also interviewed her. So various medias tried to find out what she was saying, what she thought, and it's paradoxical, but she was saying like, oh, it wasn't really clear like who was bombing us. So she was affected by the Russian propaganda, despite having lived through all of this, despite seeing like that, seeing quite clearly that I mean, who was attacking her.
Well, one of
Maternity
the
hospital.
techniques, and it's not just works in Russia. I mean, this clearly works in America. It works in multiple places. The way to imprint propaganda narratives is to combine them with fear, is to combine them with terror, to create the impression that people's values, culture, identities are under threat. And then these messages imprint much more permanently and in a much deeper as well. I think that's starting to be quite well documented. And of course, it's not surprising, not only under wartime conditions, but under the constant sort of threat, this environment that's been created of terror, it's not surprising that it percolates through.
Well, there are very many ways that Russian propaganda works, and I've been trying to read about this from the masters, from the Russians. And it turns out that there are two main ways to propagandize people, to have them start believing in what you're believing. One is the rational way, influencing people's rational thinking and rational decisions, and the other one is influencing the subconscious. And of course, this subconscious influence is they go in pair. They go together. So you work with both ways. And you mentioned fear, and that is exactly one of the conditions when a person is experiencing fear. It's a condition where this influence on his subconscious can be the greatest, basically. So by creating fear, anxiety, and other states, unstable states of the psyche, the propaganda influence can be stronger. So, and of course, in Ukraine, for instance, up till Euromaidan, very, very many people listen to Russian TV. And I am absolutely convinced that the negative reaction to Euromaidan in Ukraine's southeast that we saw basically after the Euromaidan revolution, it was in a very large way, it influenced their further perception of events over all of these 8 years towards Russia, towards Euromaidan.
And that makes the importance of the press you run and the media you create, that makes it so much more important, doesn't it? To create these independent voices, to create an alternative point of view. But your readership is largely English speaking, aren't they? So who is the readership of your output?
Well, English-speaking countries, of course, most of all, but really we do have a global audience. I mean, in 21, we had readers from every single country in the world, according to our statistics. Of course, the number one is the United States. Then after that, other English-speaking countries, Canada, UK, Australia. But really, anybody that tries to find information about Ukraine will probably do it in English around the world, and they will find us.
And how important is that, and has that been really since February, where, Ukrainians are obviously doing the hard bit, the fighting, the organizing, and the, showing this extraordinary resilience and organization. But at the same time, it's important to have supplies and equipment and money and support. So how important is that work you've been doing since February to get that message out?
Oh, it has been extremely important. And not only us, but very, very many Ukrainians took to social media to spread the message, to ask for help. Very many influencers gained their audience also in this period. So not only us, but we're part of a big Ukrainian team that is trying to communicate the message. I must say that since Euromaidan, our capacity to do this has really grown. I mean, during Euromaidan, we were one of the few accounts that were trying to talk to the world in English. But over these years, we have grown. Ukraine has grown its capacity to communicate with the world, and I'm very, very happy for this, because I'm convinced that if we are not communicating with the world, somebody else is going to be doing it for us, and not in a way that we like. So basically, yes, we try to promote the message that Ukraine is going to win, but it can only do so with the help of the whole world. That we are ready to fight. We are ready to pay with our lives to hold off this authoritarian empire, to hold it back for the whole democratic world. But we need the material to do this. We need your help. And we also try to promote the truth that it's not only Ukraine's war, it's Russia's war with the whole democratic world. It's Russia's war with the West. It's Russia's war against democracy. And I mean, Russia says it quite clearly. They hate the West, at least if you listen to their messaging. They see it as a threat to themselves, and they try to set up an alternative world order. So, I mean, we're fighting for democratic values that the Western world keeps saying are important for it. And basically, I mean, at a time when the West is getting disillusioned with democracy, it's getting disillusioned with its institutes, and basically is doubting itself. We're here ready to die for these values. We're ready to do everything to break free of an authoritarian rule. And I mean, on Euromaidan, it was very very evident that Ukrainians are ready to die for democracy, and now they're ready to die for freedom. And these are really, I think, base core values that the Western world takes for granted. We're showing how terrible it is to live without it. It's unbearable. It's better to die than live without these values. And I think we're just reminding the world how important these things that are overlooked, that you take like granted, like just the air, how important that they really is, and how fragile the system that you've built actually is, and how essential it is for the development of the free world.
And I think in that respect, you're showing us the way forward. You're reminding us of something we've perhaps forgotten, which is the centuries of struggle that led up to, the creation of parliaments, creation of the systems we have. And I think, as you say, since the Second World War, those have been, to an extent, taken for granted, and people, certainly in the UK, have perhaps been less inclined to go out and fight for those. I've always been an optimist right from the start that Ukraine would win and would triumph. However, that's now looking more and more likely, and yet Russia isn't going to go away. It's going to be there on the border. I don't think many people that I've spoken to have illusions that there is suddenly going to be a liberal government in Russia. That's most unlikely. So you are potentially going to have an aggressive, malign neighbor, as is Europe. How do you see that future then panning out, with Ukraine essentially being that new front line for the EU, but also that front line for democratic, plural values?
Well, I must say that um, the future of Russia is a question that must be discussed. I feel a reluctance to do this among Western elites and just Westerners in general, because it's like the big unknown. We don't know what will happen, and the results. Basically, there's a reluctance to do this because the hope is there that somehow it will all go back to normal. We'll go back to how it was before, and maybe we can just go back to what is usual for us. But I have bad news for you.
Yes.
No, we're not going back. The world has changed. The world order has been upended, and this needs a response. If this aggressor is not stopped, it will grow. And of course, while the question of what to do with Russia is open, I think we must really listen to what Russia's regions are saying, what its ethnic minorities are saying, because Russia, and many people don't understand this, it's just a modern empire. It has built itself, it has on colonized lands, it has colonized the peoples of Asia, of Central Asia. It is just built on the suppression of very many national identities. And I mean, this is something that I think both the West and Ukraine must support, because the Russian so-called liberal opposition, it is, I'm not afraid to say it is just as imperial in its nature as Putin is. Just if we look at Alexei Navalny and his indecisiveness regarding Crimea and who it belongs to. We cannot be sure that Russia will change if it has if the successor to Vladimir Putin is the Russian liberal opposition.
I mean,
But we
Navalny
do
has
have
said that he'd never have started the war, but the likelihood of him coming to power is next to zero, I think. So, whoever takes over in the Kremlin is not going to be any kind of liberal figure. I mean, there are ones like Ilya Yashin, who obviously was an ally of Boris Nemtsov, who is perhaps the least imperial of any of them. But again, the chances of them taking any power is zero. I would have thought. So we're faced with a potentially aggressive or even fragile and collapsing country. And I think the role of the press that you have, and the role of sort of protest and the values that you're protecting, hopefully Europe will come to realize how important that is, faced with an ongoing threat from Russia into the future. Yeah.
I don't know what to do with Russia, really. I mean, that's a big question. Nobody knows what to do with Russia. It's a big problem. I mean,
No.
nobody in the West knows, nobody in Ukraine knows, but
No.
Ukrainians definitely have a hunch that, I mean, if Russia is preserved in its imperial form, then of course we will have an enemy at our door for many, many decades to come. I mean, our military leaders are saying clearly that after this war ends, it will not end as long. An article written by our two top generals states very clearly that even if Russia withdraws into its land from Ukraine, it can still strike Ukraine with missiles. And basically, if Ukraine does not have the capacity, equal capacity to strike Russian objects far away, this war will continue in this military form. I don't know what has to happen, but let's look at an analog. Germany after the Second World War. I mean, the core of why Russia is behaving this way is its ideology. I mean, this ideology of the Russian world, it was not formed overnight. It was formed over many years, but it is the basis of this imperial thinking that gives the random Vanya in a tank the idea that he has the right to rape Ukrainian women and kill their husbands and just to rob everything everywhere. I mean, this notion of the Russian world is just an absolutely toxic ideology that is similar to Nazism, and this is what must be tackled. I mean, Germany underwent a process of denazification after the Second World War. Of course, it had questionable results in terms of consistency, but nevertheless, such a process was launched, and Germans reviewed the role in this war and the responsibility and the role of ideology. And I mean, they're still paying for this till the present day. And so far, this is something that has to be launched. I mean, if Russia is to become less dangerous than it is, we have to start from this. We have to start from the responsibility that Russians take for the actions of their leadership and for the actions of their army. They have to say that yes, we permitted this, and yes, we had this ideology of the Russian world, and that that persuaded us that we are a higher civilization, and we believed in it, and we supported Putin in this, and we did not resist. So, I mean, it has to start with that. I think it has to start with a feeling of responsibility for the crimes committed under their name. And so far, we're seeing none of this. We're seeing Russians fleeing from mobilization because they're afraid for their lives. They're not, I mean, they're not appalled at the war crimes that the Russian army is committing in Ukraine. They're not appalled at this bloody invasion and that the Kremlin's stooges and propagandists are enabling it. They're afraid for their lives. That's why they're running away. And it's really funny just to observe these dialogues of the Russians in the cars standing at the border. They're asking, "Oh, we had a letter Z shaved on the haircut of our kid. Do you think that we should maybe burn it with a lighter so they will let us through the border?" The Georgians, I mean. And I mean, it's so bizarre. They were just like Z supporters. They were Z brainwashed people, and now standing at the Russian border, they're just trying to hide all evidence of this. Zero reflection on them actually enabling this bloody invasion, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians, the deaths of Ukrainians of an absolutely and unprovoked and war. Zero reflection on this, only worrying about whether they will be let through the border with a Z shaved on their kid's head.
And I think
I
that's the
mean,
key point, isn't it? I mean, I was going to raise the example of Japan as well, because for Germany and Japan, both with the imperial, deeply anti-democratic behaviors that were seen, it was said at the time that neither of these countries could become democracies, neither of these countries could develop into pluralist societies, and yet the allies that conquered them had a plan to turn those societies around. And yes, they were occupied, as it were, in a kind of inverse imperialism by the West. But then, after a time, we withdrew, and those values did take hold and evolve there. So this is probably one of the most persistent propaganda ideas that's come through from Tsarist times, definitely into the Soviet Union, and is persistent now, that Russia is genetically, culturally incapable of developing into a democracy. And I think my understanding of the war and why Putin is waging it is because Ukraine is providing a template for how a post-Soviet, post-colonial part of the Russian Empire can actually turn into a vibrant, wealthy, pluralistic society. And that's extremely dangerous for people to actually see the truth of that and see that they could potentially, over the long term, go down a similar route.
Well, that's a very common thought. Let's leave it as a hypothesis. But I'm sure that that's not the whole story. I think that at least as large a part of the story is played by just Russia's imperial longings. It feels that it cannot be an empire without Ukraine. And this obsession with Ukraine, I think, is really something that should be questioned. I mean, why the obsession? It's a piece of land that's not that big. I mean, compared to the vast swaths of Russian land. I mean, he's not fighting here for land, but it's more about it's something symbolic, I think. It's symbolic ideas of the triunite roots. It's something about roots. I think that without Ukraine, Russia loses its European roots that it so longs for.
Mm.
I mean, just remember from um, Tsar Peter's times, that how he chopped a window into Europe. And I mean, the idea was that we have to civilize Russia somehow, that we have to draw it into European civilization. And he introduced all of these things that were very foreign for Russians at the time, and he promoted them just vehemently, like, for instance, the Christmas tree.
Mm.
Um, and promoted all of these European traditions because there was this idea that Russia is somehow uncivilized and has to be dragged into civilization. There was never this notion in Ukraine. I mean, we were just part of Europe organically. We shared very much with European history, and all the major tendencies that were in European history, we also had them, but in, like Professor Snyder says, in a much more intense way.
Yes,
So
I saw that. Yes.
so, like this obsession, Russia's obsession with Ukraine, I think that that's something that should be addressed as well when we're talking about this hypothesis that Russia was very afraid of democratic
Mm.
transformations. Although, of course, I think that idea is definitely also played a
Mm.
role.
Yeah, but possibly because so much of Russian identity and culture is actually, dare I say, acquired or borrowed from Ukrainian culture. Somehow they feel a part of them is leaving as you evolve, further. I mean, that's something that struck me as well. Living in Russia is almost the stasis, the constant resistance to stop evolution, to stop change, which you clearly don't see in Ukraine. I haven't visited, but I get the impression it's far more dynamic and forward-looking.
Well, right now, definitely, because it's a democratic country. I mean, you
Mm.
can go and organize a protest anytime that you want. Okay, well, maybe not now because it's martial law, but I mean, before the war started, I mean, these are freedoms that are unheard of in Russia. I mean, and it's hard for us even to comprehend the way that you can be just taken away for standing with a blank piece of paper. And that's the only kind of protest that you can actually organize. It's just a solitary protest with a piece of paper. And the democratic medias, and I mean, and people that keep the police in check, and people that try to influence reforms in the country. I mean, these are things that are really unheard of in Russia. Right after Euromaidan, we had a lot of activists that actually banded together to promote reforms, and they influenced a lot of processes in the government, and they were even criticized for promoting the wrong methods, the wrong directions, etc. But the fact is that a bunch of activists, they had huge influence over the government and the processes that took place. I mean, you can't even see that in many Western societies.
Mm.
Our judicial reform, it was designed basically by an NGO. Okay, well, by several NGOs, but it was designed by NGOs and it was promoted by Ukraine's Western partners who saw
Mm.
the need to support these movement towards an independent judiciary. And I mean, that is just so hugely democratic. Of course, it has um it's not over yet. It's only continuing, and I'm seeing my acquaintances that are in the sphere just criticizing how things are going and saying that, oh, it's all back to the same old story, and they're criticizing the judges. They're saying that they are corrupt, but nevertheless, they are influencing processes of creating the architecture of the judiciary, of
Mm.
Ukraine's judiciary. This is his historic thing,
Mm.
and uh, and
It's
they
not an easy
they
thing.
have the
It takes time.
possibility to influence it.
Mm.
I mean, it's for me, if you just like step back and forget a little bit about it not going smoothly, the very possibility of this happening, it's just quite unique.
Mm. I think that's going to
And
be
that just,
extraordinary, and all the
yeah.
millions of people who are now living abroad, obviously it's forced upon them, but experiencing other countries, learning other languages, I think most of them will return. And when they do, that's going to create an incredible mix. When you combine that with the resilience of the people who've remained and those who come back with all the impressions they've gained abroad, I think it's going to be an extraordinary place.
Well, that's an optimistic view. From the studies that I've been seeing, the longer they stay, the more people will stay abroad.
Mm,
Fewer people that will come back. Actually, this war is creating many challenges for Ukraine, and the demographic crisis is one of them. I mean, we did have a demographic crisis, one of the worst ones in Europe before the war, and now with the refugees and just the people killed and the people injured, it's taking a very heavy toll on the population. And just recently, I've seen this poll about that studied women with children that are staying in the near abroad, meaning Poland, Romania, Czech Republic, and others. And it was like a third of them are not planning to go home right now.
mm,
But the longer that right now, we don't know what, like, maybe later they will choose to go home, but right now, one
mm,
third is planning to stay in these countries. And the longer that the war lasts, the longer that they stay there, the more connections that they'll find, the more that they will grow roots and find jobs. And
mm.
um,
And I
the
guess it
more the
depends on
question
how
is,
stable the peace is, how much inward investment from the EU there will be. There are many unknown variables at the moment.
I'm afraid that this refugee crisis is a big opportunity for Europe to solve its problems, to solve its demographic problems, because Ukrainian refugees, they learn fast, they're culturally very similar to
Mm.
Europeans. I mean, it's a bonanza for for Europe, and I think that it's a problem that has to be addressed. I mean, this exodus of refugees, conditions have to be created for them to return.
Mm.
And the European countries should not be exploiting this crisis in Ukraine to solve their own demographic problems, which I'm afraid is happening right now. So, of course, that's an open question right now. What has to be changed in this refugee policy in order for people to go back?
Well, Alia,
And of course, yeah.
sorry.
And the sooner that the war ends, the sooner the problems will end for everybody, which is why Ukraine needs support and weapons in order to end it soon.
I think that's a wonderfully positive point to probably end on. I know it's incredibly late in Kiev at the moment, but this idea that pressure to evolve and improve something that's not yet perfect, but actually the process that you're on and the fact it continues during wartime under incredible duress and hopefully will continue when victory is secured. I mean, that's an incredibly optimistic place to perhaps end on.
Perhaps, yes. It's quite. I think it's quite symbolic that before the war, Ukrainians, they were asked the question like, "What would give you hope in your country?" And the most common answer was nothing. Ukrainians were sort of like disparaged, maybe, and had little hope for the future,
Mhm.
as they usually do. Right now, we have a full-blown war in the country, like 20% of the country is occupied. But the country, people here, Ukrainians, they are united in believing that Ukraine will win. The levels of hope have skyrocketed.
Mhm.
Ukrainians are proud of their army, they're proud of their country. I think the war made them realize like what a treasure we have here.
Mhm.
And I think they're just filled with energy to work until victory and to continue building this country that we do dream about.
And I really appreciate you speaking to me, Alia. It's been hugely thrilling, very, very informative, and thank you so much for giving up so much of your evening to talk to us.
Thank you for your interest, and thank you for having this wonderful show.